Performing a minor brake service on your Jeep Wrangler will help them perform better, last longer, and ultimately save you money. That and more on this week's Cheaper Jeeper TV. Stay tuned. So by now you've learned how to change your own oil, how to rotate your tires, and while you're at it, inspect the brakes and the fluids while you do your every 8,000 kilometer interval service. But what happens if while you're inspecting the brakes, you determine you might need a minor brake service? What does that involve? Well, in this week's episode, we're going to discuss just that. So let's get to it. So let's first have a look at what are the tools that we'll need. Of course, we'll need all the tools that we used when we did the tire rotation because we'll have to remove the tires to access the brakes. Then you'll need a ratchet, a 13mm lug nut socket, and a small pick and some brushes. As for parts, you'll need a silicone based caliper pin lube, and then a brake grease for your other caliper components. And then for torque specs, your lug nuts will be 130 foot-pounds and the caliper pin bolts are 27 foot-pounds. And now let's take a look at the area we'll be working on and get familiar with some of the parts. There's the caliper adapter, which holds everything together. Then there's your brake line. You'll have your caliper with the caliper piston. There's where your rotor is. You'll have your brake pads and your caliper pin, boot, and bolt. And there it is all together. Now when we are servicing the brakes, the minor service simply involves removing, cleaning, and lubricating the caliper pins and boots. And it'll also involve removing, cleaning, and lubricating the contact point of the brake pads to the caliper. And there's the whole system right there. So as we discussed in our last episode, we can inspect the brakes here to determine if it requires a service. And we observed in our last episode that our rear driver's side brakes were slightly unevenly worn and that there's a ton of crud caked in there. And that's why the uneven wear happens. Over the winter, sand and salt and rust will impact the way the calipers operate. So what we're going to do is take some pieces apart and lubricate them so that they function properly. Let's have a look. We'll first start by loosening the upper and the lower caliper bolts with a 13mm socket. There we go. Now they're loosened. What we're going to do is remove each of the caliper pins one at a time to clean them out. I don't know if you can see, there's a little bit of Loctite on that. If that begins to wear out, I may apply some more later. You might be able to see on that a little bit of blue Loctite, and once that wears out completely, I'll add a little bit more just to keep those snug when I reapply them. I'll take the caliper off. And just to show you, there's the caliper piston. There's some gunk on that, so part of the service will be to clean that area up. But for now, I'll take this caliper and just rest it up here. What you want to do is protect the brake line here from being stressed or stretched out. So now that I'm in close, I'm going to take out, you can see how this functions. It springs back and forth, which is what it's supposed to do. So that's good. And this one down here, it's a little bit tight, but it still moves. So that's good. I think that's why the brakes have lasted already 95,000 kilometers, and these are still the original brake pads, and I'll show you them. But you can also see how dirty they are, and we're going to clean that up and also replace the lubricant inside so that it continues to function properly. So this is a minor service which involves cleaning these components and re-lubricating them. So let's take this pin out. I'm going to pull the boot off with it. And there you can see the old grease that was in there. And I'm going to clean that off, including cleaning the boot. I'm going to reapply lube to this pin, and I'll show you, and reinsert it. You can see there I'm removing the boot to clean the pin better. Now here I'm going to clean the boot on the outside and the inside. I'll use a Q-tip to clean the inside of the caliper boot as well as the caliper where the pin is inserted. Here is the silicone-based grease that I use to lubricate the caliper pins. A link to this product will be found in the description section below the video. The silicone-based grease is rubber friendly, so it won't negatively impact the rubber on the pins or on the boot. The petroleum-based greases will cause issues, so avoid those. Here I am putting some new grease inside the caliper boot. That way it won't strip off the grease from the caliper pin itself. And here I am applying the silicone-based grease to the caliper pins. And now you put the pin inside the caliper boot, both nicely lubricated, and then insert them into the caliper. Both ends of the boot should snap into place on the caliper and the caliper pin, and the pin should be springy and bouncing in and out. And then simply repeat the process for the top pin. And there you have it. You have cleaned and lubed the upper pin, and notice the nice springy action. Well done. Now we're ready to remove and clean and re-lube the brake pads and clean the points of contact that the brake pads have with the caliper. We'll start by removing the inside brake pad. Sometimes it's a little tricky to maneuver them out, and sometimes it's a little easy. Have a look. I find that in the back brakes, the little groove in the brake pad seems to get caked up with sand and grunge from over the winter, and it's good to clear that out. I don't know if it helps with brake pad cooling or just collects debris rather than have it scrape the rotor, but this is often a piece of the brake that needs to be cleaned, as well as the rest of the brake pad, as you'll see. I like to use a small pick or straight edge screwdriver to get into the groove, and a little brush to clean up the rest of the brake pad. Then with a small brush, I clean the brackets on the caliper that the brake pads will slide on. Now you'll notice that on the back of the brake pad you will see the circular impression that the piston of the caliper makes. That is a point of contact that must be lubricated. and the ends of the brake pad, some people call them the ears, they should be lubricated as well, as those are the parts of the brake pads that slide on those brackets that we just cleaned. So I'll use the ceramic brake grease to lubricate the back of the brake pad that's in contact with the caliper and the ends of the brake pad that will be sliding on those brackets. And once you've done that, simply reinstall the brake pad. It's also important to try not to get any of the grease on the rotor, otherwise you'll have to use some brake cleaner to clean it off. So just carefully wiggle in the brake pad into place. So now we're almost done, as we just have one more pad to do on this wheel. So once again, remove the brake pad and make sure you clean the pad before you re-lubricate the parts that are in contact with the caliper and then reinstall it. And also remember to clean the brackets as well. But also, depending on what's easier for you, when you apply the grease, you can apply it to the back of the brake pad and on the ears of the brake pad, or you can apply it on the points of contact on the caliper as I'm doing now, or even on both parts if you like. And once you finish that, you can slide the brake pad back in place. Here I'm applying some grease to where the caliper will be in contact with the back of the brake pad. Now simply slide the caliper back into its original position, being careful to slide the ends of the caliper over where the caliper pins are. You just may need to depress them in a little bit to have the caliper slip over. Then install the caliper bolts by hand. And finally with a 13 mil socket to 27 foot-pounds of torque. When tightening the caliper bolt, sometimes you'll need to hold snug by hand or with a wrench a little bolt just above the boot, as you can see in this shot. In my case, holding it by hand allowed me to tighten the bolt. Sometimes you may have to use a wrench. What you are observing here is I'm adjusting the torque wrench to 27 foot-pounds to tighten the caliper bolts. And that essentially is all that's involved in a minor brake service. You'll need to do this also on the other wheels, but when you're done you'll have properly functioning brakes that will operate properly, allow your brakes to last longer, and save you a lot of money. So I hope you found that this was useful. And now let's move on to our tips feature of this week's episode. Now for some cheaper Jeeper tips. This week's tip is a tool tip. I use a cordless drill with an attachment for my lug nut socket. I quickly unscrew the lug nuts and I tighten the lug nuts using the cordless drill with this attachment. I'm always very careful though, you do not want to strip the threads. I always turn each of the lug nuts at least 5 times before I begin to tighten those lug nuts, and I seat the tire flush against the hub so that when I screw in the lug nuts I don't scratch my aluminum rims. And then of course I always finish off with a torque wrench. So I hope that you found this tip encouraging and that it motivates you to do some work on your own Jeep so that you can get the satisfaction that comes with working on your own vehicle and save a little money too. And now let's move on to our subscriber tips. And now for subscribers tips. And here's this week's subscriber tip. Hey Cheaper Jeeper TV, I bought a rolling mechanic stool for my husband for his birthday. He loved it, and I thought your viewers might also find it useful. Signed, Dolly Tool. Hey Dolly, thank you very much for your excellent tip. I also in fact happen to have one of those. It's not in the videos because I don't want it taking up space in the shots. It certainly is a back saver when you're crouched by the wheel working on the brakes and servicing them. It's also a great way to store all your tools and your lug nuts and sockets so they don't go rolling away on you down the driveway. So thank you for your tip, Dolly, on this week's subscriber tip feature. Well, that's it for this week's episode. I'll just continue working on the other brakes and just wish you a good week. And thank you all to our new subscribers to Cheaper Jeeper TV, the show that helps you get the most for your money so you can get the most for your Jeep. See you next week.